Welcome to the Essential 99 Punctuation Rules for Court Reporters, video number 15, the Semicolon, Part 2. I'm Ken Wick. Let's get started. So this video is going to cover ebook rules number 21 and 22, which are independent clauses with transitional expressions or a transitional expression, and a series of items with internal commas. So Rule 21 is a semicolon may be used to separate independent clauses joined with a conjunctive adverb or transitional expression. A period is always acceptable. So, and rule number 7 is a comma follows a multi-syllable conjunctive adverb or transitional expression. So if the word or expression has multi-syllables, comma. If it's only one syllable, no comma. So here you have an independent clause. I heard the scream. Here you have a conjunctive adverb, however. Then you have another independent clause. I did not call the police. You separate these based on the rule with a semicolon or a period. And then because this has more than one syllable, or since however has more than one syllable, you put a comma after it. So once again, this can be punctuated with a period or a semicolon right here. This comma would be required under both situations. I heard the scream, yet I did not call the police. Once again, you'd separate these two with a semicolon or a period, but because yet is only one syllable, there's no comma after yet. Personally, I think it's very common to see, I know I talk about using the period versus a semicolon, but it seems to be very acceptable now to see if you're using however to put a semicolon here. But if you found, remember rule, I think it was 18, that said don't overuse this. So if you keep having, sentence after sentence, then you'd probably want to go to just using a period because you don't want to overuse the semicolon. Here you have a beginning independent clause. I took the medicine. Then you have a transitional expression. Then you have another independent clause. I fell asleep quickly. Once again, you'd separate them with a semicolon or a period. And since this transitional expression is more than one syllable, you put a comma after it. So like I go back to my grammar things, if you've noticed through the videos, I've always broken these down by independent clause, dependent clause, and these like transitional expressions. Once I figure out and can see all these, I know exactly how to punctuate it. Rule number 22. Use a semicolon to separate 1. A series of 3 or more words, phrases, or clauses that have internal commas, or 2. A series of 3 or more long dependent clauses. And by long I mean 17 or more words. So the main rule, or the main use, or I can say of this rule, is actually going to be part 1. Basically what happens, because we talked about before that you separate a series of items with commas. Well, what happens when those series of items already have commas? Well, then what you do is you separate the series with semicolons. And maybe the main thing to remember, and this is stated in the BGGP, is that you always use, if you're using commas to separate everything, then you use commas. Or maybe I should be, you always use the same punctuation mark to separate the items in the series. So a series with internal commas. I lived in Santa Cruz, California, Seattle, Washington, and Cincinnati, Ohio. So here's 3 items. the person's listing the city and the state, and we separate those with a red between the items. Because if you just use the comma, this could technically read that you lived in Santa Cruz, and then in California, then in Seattle, then in somewhere in Washington, and then it'd be confusing. The last one would be confusing because you'd have this "and." Because technically, to be right, the person should have said Cincinnati, comma, and Ohio. But this makes it clear that you're doing city and state. For rent, she paid $1,500 on April 2nd, 2017, $1,300 on May 1st, 2017, and $200 on May 16th, 2017. Now, basically, these items are all amounts with dates. And who knows, this could just be all dates. You'd separate because whatever your listing has an internal comma, then you use the semicolon. So if you had the date or the amount, I'd use the semicolon. This helps. You could maybe say you could put a comma here and it would be understood, but technically, since the items have internal commas, use a semicolon. And two, just visually, if you use a semicolon, it helps to clearly define or break up the series of items. But the rule is the items have commas, so you use semicolons to divide up the series. Long dependent clauses. Now, for the long dependent clause, well, this rule is in the long dependent rule is in the LMAG, but it's only for dependent clauses, and it says it has 12 or more words that start with where the dependent clause starts with the word that. So it's quite specific. So the dependent clauses have to start with that and then use the semicolon when there are 12 or more. The BGGP and the Chicago Manual style do not have this rule or don't address it. Now the GRM has this rule for all cases, meaning what I mean by all cases is that the case of it doesn't have to, it doesn't limit it to the dependent clause starting with that. It could start with the other words. But while it doesn't say long, or it doesn't define long, all the examples have 17 or more words. And that's why I'm actually going with this case when I list it here. I'm actually going to follow the GRM. Because basically, in my opinion, 12 is a little too short. And this is a little too specific. But if you want to follow the LMAG, then use this. This is the reason I have this slide, is if you want to follow LMAG, you can use this right here. And this is not addressed in the BGGP or Chicago Manual style, or there's no help from them. If you want to follow Gregg's Reference Manual, you can use this. So these are just two long examples. I'm not going to read them, but you can see that we actually have a series of long dependent clauses starting with the word that. And because of that, we're going to separate them because they would need to be normally separated with a comma. So what would be the normal separator if you didn't have this rule? Well, it'd be you just use a comma because there's no internal commas here. And we know when we have a series of items of 3 or more, we use a comma. So if you weren't going to use a semicolon, you just use a comma, and these where you see these semicolons. But this one here is following basically the LMAG. And for this longer example, it doesn't contain the word that. These ones are all starting, these long dependent clauses are all starting with the word if. Well, then this one has an if, sort of an if then. So like I said before, if you didn't have this long dependent clause rule, you would actually have commas here. But per rule, when we have there are the examples in the Gregg's Reference Manual, once we get over 17 words, we can put a semicolon here. Just helps to visually break it up a little bit better. That's it for this video. Please subscribe. If you like the video, please hit like. And please buy the ebook. Thank you.